Human rights conversation of the Geneva Human Rights Platform, looking at lessons learned from the Commission for the Human Rights Council Status Review. It is at the same time presented as a side event to the ongoing 46th session of the UN Human Rights Council, and we're with you live here from Villa Moigné, Geneva. I'm Felix Kirchmeier. I'm the director of the Geneva Human Rights Platform here at the Geneva Academy, and I'll be your moderator for the next 90 minutes. We are in an online setting today, so just for some housekeeping, and this is the form of an open Zoom meeting. So I would like to ask everybody to switch off the microphones until we get to the question and answer section of the meeting. But if you wish, please do switch on your video so we can see. We have a very big screen in front of us, and it is nice, of course, not only to see black squares with names, but actually the faces participating in this meeting. You can already actually, while the panelists will be speaking, post your questions on the chat, and my colleague Julio here in the room with us will take note of them and bring them to the discussion then, and we can also call later on you to ask them yourselves. Kindly also note that this meeting is public, so it is being recorded, so just for the record. So many probably recall the speech of then Secretary General Kofi Annan in April 2005 at the Commission, when he said, "We have reached a point at which the Commission's declining credibility has cast a shadow on the reputation of the United Nations system as a whole. And where piecemeal reforms," he said, "will not be enough." He continued saying that a Human Rights Council would offer a fresh start. Further down in the same speech, he says that he has proposed, I quote again, that the Council be a standing body, able to meet when necessary, and that it should have an explicitly defined function as a chamber of peer review. Its main tasks would be to evaluate the fulfillment by all states of all their human rights obligations. This would give concrete expression to the principle that human rights are universal and indivisible. We also recall, obviously, that the Commission has done incredibly important work in standard setting, leading to the treaty-based protection system we see today. So at the discussion today, based on an excellent book published recently, we'll share the link again in the chat if you have not already downloaded the version of the flyer online for purchase of the book. So just a little commercial here. An excellent book. We will discuss how the lessons from the Commission can inform our reflections on the functioning of the Council today, how those lessons may weigh in on discussions on efficiency, on the prevention role of the Council, or again on the upcoming 21 to 26 status review by the General Assembly. I have an excellent panel with me here today to discuss this book and those questions. Both actually a panel in the room and online, so we're in a kind of hybrid setting. With me, I have here today John Pace, Secretary of the former Commission on Human Rights, coordinator of the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights, and author of the book, The United Nations Commission on Human Rights, a very great enterprise. And to my left, Adrian Claude Zoller, who is President of Geneva for Human Rights and has led a number of other human rights organizations also here before. And online with us, we have as panelists Ambassador Elisabeth Tichy-Fisselberger, permanent representative of Austria to the UN in Geneva and president of the Human Rights Council in 2020. We also have with us Ambassador Yvette Stevens, former permanent representative of Sierra Leone to the UN in Geneva, and then also chair and rapporteur of the UN Human Rights Council Expert Group on Prevention. That group met from 2019 to 2020. Also online with us, Eric Distounet, Chief of the Human Rights Council branch of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thank you all already, dear panelists, for taking the time out of your busy schedules, especially during the ongoing Human Rights Council session. Let me start with you, John, actually. Your book, The United Nations Commission on Human Rights, a very great enterprise, published by Oxford University Press, provides a detailed account of the work of the Commission to the Human Rights Council. It covers actually the time from 1946 to 2019. So why the book at this time? And aside of the academic pertinence, which I think is manifested also by the publisher, what is the relevance of that book to current political processes? Because in that setting of a Human Rights Council side event, that's of course what we'd like to get into. And also, if you might address what action would you realistically expect from governments, say between now and 26, just out of the lessons learned in the book. While in the book itself, you of course stay careful with recommendations. We want to tease out a little bit more today in our discussion how you could give recommendations also to the development of the council. So the floor is yours, Tom.
Well, thank you so much, Felix. May I take a quick opportunity to salute my fellow panelists and for the courtesy they have granted me in participating in this panel. I do hope that it will be of use to the panel members and of course to our participants, wherever they are. I see that some of them are in faraway places, and I see also a number of very, very dear names from the past. The idea of the book really is to encapsulate, to present a comprehensive account in substance and in time of all the activities taken by the Commission and the Council since 1946 to put into one entity the whole lot, and to do that in a way that is user-friendly, and to do that in a way that is dynamically identifiable. In other words, if, for example, one is interested in issues relating to administration of justice, for example, to be able to see what was done on that subject and when until today. For those, for example, who wish to compare the Council with the Commission, let's say, it is then very easy to see what the Council has done since 2008 and what happened before since 1946. In other words, the idea is to give a tool to those who are involved in the discussions on the future of the Council, a workable and user-friendly version of everything that happened. It sounds a bit ambitious, and I suppose on the face of it, it may look. But in developing this book, I must say, this work took over at the risk of sounding marginally insane. I used to share with my wife that the book was actually talking back to me from time to time, suggesting that certain parts should not be where they were, but somewhere else. And that, compared to my own privileged exposure over about 50 years in all to human rights, kind of combined in to produce what the result you have before you. The second point was to make this work user-friendly. There is a note for the reader page at the beginning, which gives the URLs of the digital libraries. And as I say in my acknowledgements, which is quite short, I pay tribute, heartfelt tribute, to the UN libraries in Geneva and New York for their amazing support in this regard. The digital libraries that they have put together and the materials they have kindly inserted at my request over the years has now contributed to anybody being able to see anything they want, including, for example, perhaps what might consider as useless, the yearbooks on human rights, which are actually quite interesting. They were around for 25 years. They were the first example of a tentative approach to accountability by states during the Cold War. But there they are, it's all online. This, therefore, comprehensiveness and user-friendliness, I hope, enables people, readers, users, to fix the directions and the related adjustments that they think they should bring to these directions. Has it done well? Has it not done well? My colleague Eric, in his excellent book, mentions, for example, as an underlining the failures of the Commission, which are quite a lot, the omissions on the genocide in Cambodia and in Rwanda, for example. And it's very easy to be able to see that happening and why and so forth. So the book helps to do that. It also brings out trends. You will see, for example, that when the Commission finished with the drafting of the Declaration of the International Bill of Human Rights in 1954, it passed on to advisory services, which later on in the 80s became technical cooperation, and so on. The first investigations in South Africa, Palestine, and Chile. And then what came after today, they turned into a system with a lot of such activities. The 1980s comes the Voluntary Fund on Technical Cooperation, and then a critical period in the Commission's life was 1994. 1994 came just after the World Conference. The World Conference drafted or prepared, developed, if you like, with an international consensus of the 171 countries in Vienna and the 841 NGOs in Vienna in June 1993, the agenda which is still being pursued, really. And but what also happened in 94 was the end of apartheid. The end of apartheid actually removed a key factor in the work of which had characterized the work of the Commission ever since its inception. And from then on, the Commission started to kind of float. I'm not identifying that fact as the sole fact, but there was a clear need to look at itself, the Commission. It is at that time that I frankly felt rather disappointed that the World Conference was not in a position to end the Commission there and set up a new council at that time. It did for the Human Rights Commissioner, such as it is. We can talk about that later if you wish, but certainly it was a serious omission that created a kind of stillborn, as it were, the Commission on Human Rights after Vienna. As you see from the record, especially in Eric's excellent book, there was no way except down, if you like. So, but that is very important. That inspired the Kofi Annan reforms of the late 90s and early 2000s, and in which I think, you know, I served since Secretary General Utant, actually, and I started in '66, and they were all probably very good Secretary General. But in terms of human rights, I believe that Kofi Annan was the most closest to the philosophy and the need for human rights to be integrated into the system. How am I doing for time?
We still have 10 minutes to go.
Okay, so that means I have another 25, right? No, I'm joking. Now, anyway, as the panel on threats and on change and threats said, in looking at a new form of commission, they said change for its own sake is likely to run the well-known course of the endless reform debates of the past decades. That's quoted in the book, and that is why at this time, with the review of the work of the Council, it is important to have at present a total record of the not only of what happened, but of when it happened and why it happened. And finally, the phase of mainstreaming, where Kofi Annan tried to integrate, and successfully so, the work of on human rights into the Security Council operations. The UN Development Programme started its development assistance framework. The World Bank had a similar formula on a comprehensive program on technical cooperation, I think it was called, during the days of the then Director General of the World Bank. So we have, if we want to, on paper at least, a very integrated and an excellent machine that perhaps is the victim of its own success, because we're looking at the treaties, we're looking at the Council's work and the various initiatives it takes. But in the process, I believe, and again, the book was, I'm not joking this, the book said to me when I finished the chapter 10 on people, on civil society. But where do you go from here? And sat back a bit, went over the book for the umpteenth time, and said, well, clearly, civil society has been given a very raw deal. Civil society, in reality, remains since the very beginning. We look at the Modalia statements when the Council Commission was being set up, the reforms of the draft charter in 1945. Civil society, human rights NGOs specifically, were an integral part of the process. Today, they are very much on the margin. They are other participants, as it were. Human nature being what it is clear that they do participate, but in a way, à la cachette, informally, or somehow, certainly, their effect is not felt. I'm not blaming the Council as such, but certainly there is a situation regarding civil society which needs attention. The session last year at this time had, I think, 390, I counted them on the report of the Council. How can you give any kind of meaningful attention to what 390 NGOs have to say or hear? The next was in my opinion, at least now here in my opinion, the sheer waste of the jurisprudence developed by what they call the covenant bodies. The Human Rights Committee under the ICCPR and its twin sister or brother, the ICCSCR, have developed an excellent jurisprudence that the Council obviously either does not want to or cannot or somehow has missed out on. And there's not a single, what shall I say, I'm sorry, I was distracted by something that came up. But I do believe anyway that it is essential for the knowledge, the jurisprudence of the Council to benefit, or of the treaty bodies to benefit the Council. The proposals coming from the chairperson's meeting 2 years ago are very valuable, and I believe they will probably be taken up. I can't go into detail. Anyway, the book therefore suggests, as a proposal to provoke discussion, a permanent body like the panel on threats of the whole, to remove all this unnecessary discussion about who's a nice country and who isn't about human rights. The book really argues the point that everybody is the same, but some are in greater need than others. But it's immaterial what the degree of goodness or badness is. And secondly, that Council of the Whole should be supported by two chambers. The Chamber on Civil Society, maybe we could take a quick look at that one, Yasmin, if you like. The Chamber on Civil Society and the Chamber on Norms and Standards. We could show that screen. I think you might be familiar with it, but this is essentially what it looks like. There you go. So the Chamber for Norms and Standards has the main body, which is the two covenant bodies, supported by the treaty bodies of the other treaties, according to the specificity required. And the Chamber for Civil Society would coordinate regional forums in the 5 regions. This is not a new concept. In preparing the World Conference in 1992, the regional meetings that took place in Africa and Asia, Pacific, and in the Caribbean were very good examples of how well civil society can actually support locally and internationally. In any case, I will leave it at that. It's all very kind of generic, but this is how the book ends, and this is how I felt that the book needs to achieve the purpose for which it was created. Okay? Thank you very much again. I'm more than happy to answer whatever I could. But very kind of you to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And indeed, we'll get in the discussion into many more of the questions. And as you also noted, already questions are coming in by the chat, so I'll keep track of those. Thank you for that.
You're right.
presentation.
And being a real geek and listening to a Geneva Academy.
Sorry, Rosa, yes, thank you for muting. So thanks for presenting actually what you say, that comprehensive, user-friendly book, and comprehensive it surely also is. And I think what is really interesting here too is what you just closed on, actually, to see how proposals that seem quite far-reaching, and maybe, well, we'll discuss the political feasibility of those, but how they still actually root in discussions from 1993 or 92, as you said, from the development or preparation of the World Conference. So I think it's interesting to see, and we saw that ourselves when we engaged over the last years at the Academy in the discussions around the review of the treaty bodies, how many ideas had been voiced, had not found the political support, are coming back. So really this building on this wealth of discussions that have been taking place before. Now, if I could turn to Ambassador Tiff Wieselberger. Having presided the Human Rights Council until lately, where would you see, in reaction to also the input by this book, where would you see most need for institutional discussions? And what is your evaluation of the potential for progress in that intergovernmental work? So, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, dear Mr. Pace, dear co-panelists, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I've seen there many personal friends on the participants list. Very nice to see you. I'm very touched to have been invited to this event by people who have thought all their lives about the Human Rights Council and who have pondered this a lot and really have tried to find the right answers to tricky questions. I haven't had so much time to do that. I would also like to very much congratulate Mr. Pace for his book. I tried to start reading it. I have not worked myself through the 900 pages, but I already do realize that this is the ultimate masterpiece of research on the Human Rights Commission. It shows both the bright side of what was achieved and the dark side of what is still an unfinished agenda. And I can only admire the amount of dedication which went into it. Human rights need unperturbed fighters, lifelong, like yourselves. Well, I said I didn't manage to read it all, but I came across this sentence, which I like. There may never be a utopia, but there can be a much smaller gap between rhetoric and reality. I think this is what we're all up to, and it's not so easy. The previous High Commissioner, Kate Gilmer, had a habit of saying you cannot blame an apple for not being an orange. What she meant to say was that the Human Rights Council is a diplomatic body. It is not a human rights court. It is not a rapid reaction force. And the essence of diplomacy is to keep channels of dialogue open, however much you may disagree with your interlocutor. And this is exactly the gymnastic exercise we're doing all the time in the Human Rights Council. We try to point out where the problems are in the hope of nudging other countries to make some improvements. And if we fail to do so, we make sure that at least the topic stays on the agenda and doesn't fall into oblivion. This basic operating principle of the Council, I think, is unlikely to change. Now, 10 years ago, the Council envisaged to have a review in the years 2021 to 26, which, strictly speaking, should be limited to the question whether the Council should remain a subsidiary body to the General Assembly or whether it should get some kind of upgrade. I come from a country where we would quite like that upgrade, but I must say personally, I don't think it would do the trick some people think. And it is, I think, a utopian endeavor rather, because it would take a change of the charter, and we all know how difficult that would be. Now, what would have a real chance of getting through, and what would make sense? In the last years, the Council had embarked on a number of measures of micromanagement and actually achieved some baby steps, I would say, of improving the efficiency. But the sad truth is that most of these changes came about under the threat that New York would stop to pay. We have to be realists. The financial pressure of the UN is not going to go away, just as little as the habit of some countries to leverage that lack of liquidity for opposing scrutiny of human rights violations. However much the Secretary General has called for improvements in his global call to action. So we have to do with the means we have. Last year, we had to reinvent basically the modus operandi of the council because of the pandemic. And what would have been difficult in normal times actually was adopted fairly easily as a makeshift way of operating, with hybrid meetings and even electronic voting as adopted this morning. Some of that virtual way of working is good news. For example, it allowed us last year to get out a little bit of the Geneva bubble, to talk actually to human rights defenders from all over the world, not just to those who are present in Geneva. We managed during 2 urgent debates to really get closer to the ground. We had the brother of Mr. George Floyd participating in an urgent debate about racism, and we had the leader of the Belarusian opposition participate in an urgent debate on Belarus. The Council also reacted more quickly than any other body of the United Nations to the pandemic. Yet, on the other hand, this virtual way of working does have shortcomings as well. It is, for example, a lot of it has to do with the agenda as well. The Council had to resort 6 years ago to limiting speaking time, which of course is a good thing and was a necessary thing. But it turns out that people, instead of really limiting things to the essentials, started speed reading. Now, if you have speed read speeches, which on top of everything else get pre-recorded, there is a high risk that nobody listens anymore to what other people have to say, and that the Council stops being what it should be, which is interactive. This kind of modus operandi becomes really absurd when you see that you get 3 to 4 times as much time to exercise your right of reply than you get for making statements on substance. We have to, once we have overcome the pandemic, I think we'll have to start analyzing which of the new methods of working we should preserve and which ones we should rather drop. I personally think that for sharing information, for having a routine agenda, it's perfectly sufficient to have virtual meetings. But nothing can replace physical presence when it comes to real negotiation about sensitive subjects and when it comes to making real trade-offs. Some of the problems the country is having has to do with agenda, which I know is a historic compromise. But let me tell this. I have a minister who is very well acquainted with international organizations like the European Union. He's used to having agendas which get fixed about 2 weeks before the respective meeting, and there's always an agenda point called any other business. He couldn't believe that the Human Rights Council had had the same agenda for the last 15 years at every single meeting, and that there was no such thing as a point any other business. So this shows this is very specific. And I know it's a difficult subject, but I would venture to say we have to become more flexible about the agenda. There is not necessarily a need to discuss the same things over and over again the way we do it. The Council needs pathways to more informal debates. Special sessions and urgent debates are already quite suitable instruments for reacting to unforeseen events, but we can do more. We should make a better use of the intersessional periods. Formal sessions tend to be totally overcrowded by panels, seminars, side events, all of which happen in parallel. We should really spread them out. We need also time to cover new topics. The Secretary General and the High Commissioner remind us very often that we need to take up the challenges like human rights, the human rights angle of such things as climate change, new technologies, governance deficiencies. With our very ritualized time management, we have little time for covering these subjects. Another issue is human rights actors. Some tech companies and transnational corporations are a lot more influential than most states are. And they do trigger human rights issues. Now, the classical definition of human rights is that these are rights granted by the state to its citizens. But what does that mean if non-state actors are a lot more powerful than those states? Is it really sufficient to leave human rights concern to the self-regulation of business? The High Commissioner keeps saying that we shouldn't talk about ethics, because ethics is the stuff that companies can change from one day to the other. This is not what we want for human rights. Businesses and non-state actors are very important. We have to find a way of exchange with them. They're not the only non-state actors. Non-state actors include everything from victims of human rights violations, starting with indigenous peoples or minorities, to criminals like terror organizations. Okay, now, one sort of very important non-state actors are civil society organizations, which have a meaningful role in the Human Rights Council, much more meaningful than anywhere else in the UN system, but that doesn't mean that there isn't room for improvement. We all know some of these NGOs have won Nobel Peace Prizes, others clearly never would. They are rather single-issue lobbies who impose their agenda on whether it is relevant or not. Then we have the gongos, invented by governance to praise them and to take away speaking time from others. And you have already mentioned the problem of just having too many NGOs who would be interested in taking the floor. The present president has found an interesting compromise of how to handle the problem. She just said that as many NGOs would be able to speak as was the average of similar dialogues in previous meetings, but we'll have to find some kind of management for dealing with NGOs. The council depends very much on the quality of information it receives. Part of that is information which comes from NGOs. Another part of the information comes from the Universal Periodic Review, and yet another part of the information comes from the various special procedures. Now, there is room for improvement just about everywhere. The UPR, let's face it, has become rather ritualized over the years. It is difficult to explain to an outsider that a single country, like Switzerland, like Norway, gets hundreds of recommendations. And the way we organize the adoptions of these recommendations really isn't the ultimate wisdom either. Then the question is, of course, countries which are afraid of criticism, they can just ask their friends to spend a lot of time praising them, to take away speaking time from those who would be more critical. Is that an ideal way of proceeding? I leave that question to you. Then we have special procedures. At the moment, we have 70 mandates and around 100 individual mandate holders. I bet nobody can enumerate all of them, and nobody really has an overview of how many overlaps we have. We should focus more on impact. I know the subject matter is very political. Attempts have been made to merge mandates that turned out to be more or less impossible, but we should at least encourage delegation in the future not to invent new mandates, but rather to try enriching the existing ones. I tried to press the Secretariat last year to give us a little bit more transparency in terms of telling delegations how much new mandates would cost before they actually get adopted. And I do hope that this practice will go on under my successors. I will not say anything about treaty bodies because I've already run out of time, and also I haven't worked with treaty bodies very much myself. But of course, we all know the way they operate is suboptimal as well. On the one hand, we moan that about 80% of countries do not comply with their reporting obligations. But on the other hand, we know it would be a disaster if they did, because nobody would have the capacity of dealing with all these reports. Apart from these questions, there are still the very essential ones. The prevention mandate. Of course, Ambassador Stevens is going to talk about that more because that's what she focused on in the last 2 years. But let me just say this, however controversial that may be politically, the best problems, the best tensions are the ones which we manage to prevent from happening in the first place. And this is why there should be some kind of meaningful interaction also with the Security Council. In the past years, the Security Council occasionally invited special procedure mandate holders to brief it. That is something which should be continued. maybe in a low-key way if it causes problems with some delegations, and we should also encourage special procedure mandate holders to write more readable reports, more concise reports for that kind of purpose. I myself had the honor of briefing the Security Council once last year. It was also the year when the Council adopted the resolution on prevention, encouraging the High Commissioner to step up the prevention angle in her mission and to actually alert member states if she thought that some kind of crisis was threatening. So this is part of the wider question between how we should deal between Geneva and New York. There is strong interlinkage in substance. It seems to me that the relation with New York is rather one way. We are more interested than they are. But at the same time, we all complain about silos. So we should try to find a meaningful way of working together. So we have a lot of unfinished agenda, and more is going to be mentioned by other speakers. Personally, I don't believe that there will be a big bang, neither as a result of the review nor of anything else. In the end of the day, any reform boils down to a question of political will, and political will doesn't just develop like that out of the blue. There are no blockbusters in the history of the Human Rights Council, and there will be none in the future, I think. All progress has always been incremental, but that is already a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this excellent intervention and actually your recall of progress made incrementally and not via a big bang, and to see like how that could be taken on actually step by step in the Council, including the links, as you mentioned, to the Security Council, the treaty body system, as also brought up by John Pace before, and how that could develop. You also made the link to the preventive role of the Council, which leads me neatly to our next speaker, Ambassador Yvette Stevens. As I said, you had been permanent representative of Sierra Leone to the Council, to the UN in Geneva, and in the Council, you headed this expert group on prevention. So taking it also again from the book, are updates or chances proposed in Mr. Pace's book relevant and realistic to you? And where would you see links to the recent institutional debates in the Council, the ongoing debates indeed, including those on the prevention role of the Council? So Ambassador Stevens, the floor is yours.
Yes, let me first thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I feel most honored to be a member of a panel where we have the brains in relation to human rights and the history of human rights in the United Nations, and I'm deeply honored. My experience with human rights was for 6 years when I was permanent representative of Sierra Leone to the United Nations here in Geneva, and served as a member of the Human Rights Council for 3 years, and the other 3 years I was active as observer. And then later, of course, I was chair rapporteur for this task that was given to a group of us to look at how the council could enhance its prevention role. So I'll be speaking from that angle. I must say that when I looked at and thank you very much, Mr. Pace, for sending the resume. I mean, you sent us the resume, the short version, which was very useful. I learned a lot, and I thought, oh wow, there was so much I didn't know about the evolution of human rights within the United Nations that probably I needed to know. But thank you very much. I think this book that you spent is really a big legacy that you're going to leave to the world in terms of looking at human rights. Now, in terms of looking at the final recommendation represented in the table you gave, I looked at some of the shortcomings of the current system as we identified during our work on the prevention mandate, and how to say how much this your proposition addresses some of these things, and then to say, and I think Ambassador Tishi feels like has given the political part of it, and why some of these are not going to probably fly as we would like to because of political consideration. But I will touch on that at the end. First of all, when we look at what are the shortcomings of the common system as we view them, first of all, there's the duplication at multiple levels. We have the Human Rights Council and treaty bodies, the Human Rights Council and the Third Committee. There's a lot of duplication. When I was ambassador, I actually represented my country in four treaty body sessions. And I could tell you that I was answering to the same questions in all three. And it was the same questions that we had to come up with for the Universal Periodic Review. So there's a lot of duplication of effort. And there needs to be a system where this duplication could be minimized, if even not avoided. Again, viewed from the member states themselves, especially a small country like mine, I mean, writing these multiple reports on the same thing to different bodies already requires a lot of time and probably explains why sometimes these reports are not forthcoming. Then we also see that the council itself has a limited mandate for enforcement of its decisions. It is not even states that are members of the council, they do not grant access to special procedures mandate holders, and there's virtually no recourse. What happens when a country who is a member of the Human Rights Council refuses for a special mandate holder to even enter their countries? No recourse at all. It is true that evidence could be collected which could be used later, but if many of some of the bodies that were created by the council have not been able to even enter the country they are supposed to be the country mandates. Also, the last thing also which my ambassador referred to is the lack of formal links with the Security Council. And this is something which is very critical, because maybe there would be more impact of the work of the Human Rights Council if only it could have that link with the Security Council. First of all, to ensure that human rights are taken into account in specific country situations, but also to ensure that early warning information collected by the human rights mechanisms reach the Security Council on time. Because what we have now, in fact, is that even within the Human Rights Council, is that these issues are only handled when the genie is out of the bottle, and then it becomes very difficult to put it back. So many of these human rights situations, they are being discussed, and civil society are talking about it, but the Human Rights Council itself doesn't have a mechanism in place right now where they could act on these mechanisms. And I think one of the recommendations we gave was that the office of the High Commissioner should be better equipped to analyze all these reports that come in as early warning, and the council should be able to act upon them before they reach a stage where, the stage where the special session is called upon to act upon it, in which case, some of the time, first of all, to get the special session already requires a number of signatures for that. And then the whole political considerations come into effect. The country that is to be reviewed has its own friends on one side, and it gets to a point where, as Ambassador said earlier, that we have not had try to prevent this crisis at the very early stages. Then also, if you look at increasingly, when we talk, there's slow recognition of the importance of human rights to overall peace and security. And there have been proclamations. The last High Commissioner spoke about human rights as the fundamental basis for sustainable development and peace. The current Secretary General speaks about a culture of peace is inseparable from human rights. But in spite of all this, there's no formal dialogue between the Human Rights Council and the Security Council. And this is something which is so essential to increase the impact of the work of the Human Rights Council, but that does not exist. And that is resisted, in fact. It's not only that it doesn't exist, it is resisted by some permanent members of the Security Council to this point. I could not understand how we could say that human rights is important for peace, and yet and yet there should be no interaction between the body that is dealing with human rights and the body that is dealing with peace and security, no formal interaction. So again, I mean, there was some hope was raised in the sustaining peace. I'm looking at the sustaining peace, the twin resolutions that came out, and everybody said, now we have twin resolutions, you know, that is discussing, talking about link between human rights development and peace, sustaining peace. But one thing that is interesting with these twin resolutions, it's that in the preambular paragraphs, it mentions human rights. It says, recognizing that development, peace, and security and human rights are interlinked and mutually reinforcing. It goes on to say that emphasizing the importance of a comprehensive approach to sustaining peace, particularly through human rights. But then in the operative paragraphs, the only time that human rights is mentioned is only asking for member states of the Human Rights Council to consider the human rights dimensions of peace building as appropriate in the Universal Periodic Review. So there was the expectation raised, but then when you look at it carefully, it did not handle this importantly, and this is important. Then also, I think Mr. Pace also mentioned the role of civil society. The civil society, the traditional role is seen as relevant and effective. And I think Mr. Pace mentioned this in the context of the Vienna conference. However, the civil society is seeing its role even reduced, because, for instance, in the Universal Periodic Review, they can only comment when the report comes to, and only if time allows. That's what it says, only if time allows. So that engagement, although you could say that OHCHR is one of the background documents of the UPR, is putting together inputs from NGOs. But that is a perception that NGOs see the role in the whole process as being reduced. Now, again, one thing again we looked at is the slow implementation of the UPR recommendations, and I realized from the extracts I was reading from the book that indeed one of the recommendations we made about implementation of UPR recommendations actually came in the report of the 2011 review, where it said, and I think I saw this there, that it says that the office, where it gives the office of the High Commissioner to act as a clearinghouse for assistance, which was what we recommended in the review, that you know, there should be a sort of what we had called a sort of facility that would assist countries in terms of implementation of these recommendations. Okay, now, so again, how do the proposals in the book address these shortcomings, which I've highlighted? First of all, it looks at the duplication by trying to have this, if we see the diagram, which Mr. Pace put up, it has this chamber of norms and standards, which would bring together all the treaty bodies, and the Human Rights Committee, the Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. So bringing this together could create a situation where this duplication might be avoided. The second thing is, okay, the second thing is that the status of the council, and I'm saying now just by reviewing the diagram, giving the council a higher status could probably boost the work of the council, because if it's working, it is considered to be closer to the status of the Security Council, which it could never be, because we all know that the Security Council has the ultimate responsibility for peace and security. Then this proposal also enhances the role of civil society. But then I would end by looking at the challenges. First of all, the proposal proposes, what happened? It proposes, what happened?
We hear and see you well, actually.
Yeah, okay, but so something has happened, okay. The proposal, it proposes a change, amending the UN Charter. Now, that is going to be a tall order. And I'm not sure that this will see the light of day. Some permanent members of the Security Council might not support the idea of looking at this and giving the Human Rights Council a role that could be compared to that of the Security Council or close. Now, also, the second part of it is getting a body of all member states. The permanent body is to be made up of all member states. And there again, I believe that that would make decisions much harder to reach and would be subject to greater polarization. Now, in terms of the civil society forum, if you like, is that would have to be the acceptance of the role of civil society as what apparently is at the same level as the treaty bodies would be difficult for member states to accept. So somehow there has to be some way of doing this. In conclusion, I would like to say that the proposals reflect the long experience of the author and will address some of the problems identified above. However, more consideration would need to be given on how the different components in the organogram of the proposed structure would work together. The devil will be in the details. Will the Permanent Council for Human Rights be given authority to enforce action in UN member states, similar to the Security Council? What would be the relationship between the Security Council and the Permanent Council? So just to end, I would say that I could see in the proposal the experience of the author being reflected. And what came out was a logical thinking of how to enhance the role of the human rights. But there are real formidable problems that would make it difficult to implement. I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm conscious of time. That's sorry why I also interrupted there. Thank you very much for your intervention, and thank you for pointing out that what you say also, that lack of formal links that you see in the system, and that maybe John would in the round of question and answer also come back to. So I will not comment on this for the sake of timing also. So now let me come to our next speaker, to Eric Tistounet. So working in detail on the mechanisms of the Human Rights Council, as you do, Eric, and we know it is by your work, but we know it also by the book that you have published lately on the Human Rights Council. Where do you see the link between the proposals put forward by John Pace to the rather immediate questions that you see in the Council, including, for example, where the next round of the UPR should go? Are there chances to strengthen connectivity, as was also pointed out as a need by previous speakers? Connectivity is to the expert parts of the system, say special rapporteurs, treaty bodies, and UPR. So some reflections on that would be most welcome. And with this, over to you, Eric, please.
Well, thank you very much, Felix, and good afternoon to John Pace. It's a great pleasure to see him again, and it's a great pleasure to be with a co-panelist and to see you all there. I need to start by saying that John has done really a great piece of work. It's a masterpiece. It's very important because when I was working on my own book, I realized how difficult it is to actually have the big picture in terms of what the Commission did and what the Council is doing. It's almost impossible for any scholar, any researcher, any diplomat to get the information at hand. It's a huge endeavor, and I don't know how you did it, John, but really hats off. It's something which I really do consider as one of the major masterpieces in the field of human rights in the past decades with S. So I salute you for this. Thinking about the review and this crucial period of time which we are finding ourselves in, both in terms of what Ambassador Tichy Fisselberger was mentioning earlier on about the COVID-19 and the impact on the work of the Council, but also the review and everything which is connected to it. I think books like John's and this, especially the epilogue, is extremely important because they remind us of what needs to be our vision and the ambitions behind. We need to see the big picture and never forgetting that we need to think out of the box. And I love very much a subtitle to this book, which is a very great enterprise. And although I'm a bureaucrat, and I think that all of us, when we get into room 20, either physically or virtually, we need always to remember that what this very big and great enterprise is all about is to changing the life of people, to having an impact on what the world is all about and how human rights are implemented in the field, and the impact of what actually is being done in this noble Palais des Nations. And this is something where we need to rely on ideas like John's ideas, because they trigger, they stimulate. Of course, we need to be realistic and think about what the international community can deliver at any given point in time. But at the same time, it's important to keep that in mind. And I was so proud to work with Ambassador Tichy Fisselberger last year when the Council came to a halt, because it would have been so easy to just say, okay, let's wait until we can actually resume our work, and we would have waited for more than 1 year. But thanks to her, thanks to a bureau, thanks to everyone, I hope including the Secretariat, we managed to put back this machine into motion, and human rights program continued, and the Council continued to deliver and to do what it had to do. And same thing, I was very glad and proud to work with Ambassador Yvette Stevens when she was working on this big enterprise, which is reconciling us with the notion of prevention and trying to go beyond the usual political boundaries, the usual thinking of East versus West or North versus South, and just to put back square into motion what matters. That is to say, you need to prevent human rights violations, because it's then much easier to cope at the later stage with everything which is happening. Now you have asked me to think about the UPR and to deal about what John has referred to. And I think I would just like to mention how important it is to remember that, yes, there is the review of the status of the Council. That is something which is going to be done in the period of time between this year and 2026. No, there will be no review of the work and functioning of the Council, but we do have an efficiency program, which is something articulated every year, and I think progress has been made, but something which has been sort of dormant and not really seen is the UPR, and more broadly the mechanism themselves. And for the UPR, the next year, 2022, will be the start of the 4th cycle. And frankly speaking, and I'm speaking in my personal capacity, I always fear that when you do have a mechanism which is working well, which everyone applauds, and if you don't really look into issues which could be fixed and bettered and made more efficient, then it is a step backward. So I would hate to see this 4th cycle to be exactly like the 3rd cycle, which was exactly like the 2nd cycle. I think it's time to bring a bit of adrenaline into the work of the UPR. We have talked about various things which could be done, but let me remind you of something maybe you are not aware of. When Louis Arbour was working on the UPR initially, the idea which he had in mind and which we worked on a lot was to have 2 stages, a working group of experts followed by consideration of the outcome in plenary. This didn't fly. And the president and the bureau and the coordinator asked Louis to just withdraw this idea. And this is why you do now have a working group which is composed of exactly the same number of member states as the plenary and operates in the same manner. I don't think we will ever get back to a situation with a working group of experts. That's not something which can happen anytime soon. However, what has been lost in between is the notion of linking with the treaty bodies and with the special rapporteur. Obviously, you do have a document which we call the compilation of treaty bodies and special rapporteur and other UN bodies input, and this is something which is very helpful. However, what goes beyond this is not there. There is no contact whatsoever between this council and the UPR and the treaty bodies or the special rapporteur, or they are not being listened. They are not even in the room when this happens, and they have not even given a chance to speak. And I think that this could be addressed. in a way or another. In the same manner that when you do have a special session, automatically at the podium, virtually or in person, you do have a representative of special rapporteur coordinating committee. We don't have this sort of feature when we are dealing with the UPR. So these are concrete things which we could think about and try to make a better use of. The Office of the High Commissioner is also producing a letter at every session to address to all the 14 states which are being UPRized or reviewed. And this contains a summary of the main recommendations and actually an overview of what needs to be done or what should be done by the state. This is also something which is not really well known and which would need to be worked on. But getting back to the UPR and more broadly, the mechanism, what are we doing now? In my book, I've dwelt on a number of shortcomings of the Commission, but also of the Council. But one of the main shortcomings of the Council is that it has taken a great deal of time thinking about issues like linking with other bodies and so on. But what about special rapporteur? Are we satisfied with the way we are dealing with them? I don't think that this is the case. This sort of virtual meetings and interactive dialogues, I think, should be rectified and addressed and bettered. Same thing with the advisory committee, which is the follower of the subcommission created at the time of the commission. But this poor advisory committee had been left somewhere completely forgotten and very often not even heard of, and we need to find ways to link with them. And treaty bodies, they have been left out simply by fear of them being under the monitoring and supervision of the Council, which was seen and perceived as potentially an appeals court against the findings of the committees. And I think that this fear, which might have been legitimate 15 years ago, is not legitimate anymore. So there must be a way to bring them back into the picture, either during the UPR, but also in the normal work of the Council. How to do it is something which we can discuss. But I think, Felix, that I've reached the end of my time, and that it's important now to get into a dialogue with the audience. And thank you very much. And again, congratulations, John.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you for those practical steps also where you do not only see challenges, but where you also see that there is a potential that something could be changed. And as you say, it's about changing the life of people. And this brings me also nicely to the last speaker of this panel before then inviting the questions from the audience to Adrien Zoller. So also speaking of a difference in the life of the people, making a difference on the ground, implementation, all those keywords that we hear a lot in the Human Rights Council. So Adrien, what's the relevance of the suggestions, well, of the discussion that we heard of the steps to be taken, but also obviously of those brought up by John in the book, in terms of civil society participation in the Human Rights Council, and given the current context, and actually the experience of recent review efforts of, say, for example, the treaty bodies, is it a good time to get into the discussions of those working methods, of the status even, or what needs to be done concretely? So over to you.
Thank you. Nice to be here with John Pache. It's a long time ago. And to see also so many friends who together with John were also in Vienna at the World Conference on Human Rights. I have notes, but I prefer to ignore some of my notes and to focus on these questions regarding NGOs. But first, I have to make two remarks. My first remark is how grateful we can be on two persons for last year, namely the President of the Human Rights Council and Eric Tistoulet, who have taken a lot of initiative to make this council surviving in an impossible period, and to keep what could be kept in working methods, including in the minimum rights of NGOs. Now, much more should be done for NGOs. Second remark is that I am not speaking about the UN. The civil society, the NGOs, are working for human rights. They are working with partners in the field. and they expect from the audiences, from the body, where they address their complaints, their communication, their information, they expect progress. They expect something like, I would use the word of reparation. And this is what is at the center of the life of the human rights movement since I know it, since I've been involved in it in 1979 here in Geneva. So let me just recall where we come from. We come from a UN system, which is a system of states, which during 20 years has adopted a doctrine, which is the no power doctrine, where they said the Commission on Human Rights was not competent to intervene. And we see the last part of this in the book of John Pache, and how this has led to a public and private debates, which have led to some initiatives regarding the country situations. Second, the first initiatives in the United Nations to raise country situations, violations of human rights inside countries, were not initiatives from the West, but from the South. It is India who took the initiative already back in 1952. It is on apartheid. And this work has led to all what John has described in his book on the anti-apartheid campaign of the UN, which has been one of the pillars of the current human rights system. It was the League of Arab States who were at the origin of the initiatives regarding Palestine and the Israeli Arab occupied territories. So I believe that it is important to remind people that what we speak about when we deal with special procedure is not a Western system. It is a universal system, and it is a result of concrete initiatives of newcomers in the UN system. There have been 4 exceptions to the principle of universality, to the principle of independence of the state, of non-interference. These 4 are Equatorial Guinea. It is the last one in 79. It was Chile, it was Palestine, and it was India. And this was the beginning. And from that moment, it was possible. The second remark I make on the origin of the work currently in the Human Rights Council and previously in the Commission is that you had 2 major factors in the work of the Commission. The first one has been the sub-commission. And the sub-commission made all kinds of studies. It drafted principles, and we see many details in your book, John, but it also was entrusted by the Economic and Social Council and by the Commission. The sub-commission, the experts, independent, were entrusted to deal with communications and then to be part of the confidential procedure and then to adopt resolutions on countries. So it is decisions taken by the states at that moment, and the sub-commission members adopted resolutions on Greece, on Cambodia, Tibet, China, Bhutan, Mexico, Congo, Togo, to quote only those who were not object of resolutions by the Commission on Human Rights. And so one of the main problems in the 90s has been to reduce this sub-commission to silence. And the campaign, which started by some states to discredit the sub-commission, was a campaign accusing the Commission on Human Rights to be discredited. And the main problem was, and is still the day of today, the fact that there are big human rights violations in the world, and that the United Nations will have to deal with it, and that even in the Human Rights Council, which is even at a higher level in the UN system, they will have to deal with it. And so it creates the problems currently with other states than 20 or 30 years ago. Now, from the Commission on Human Rights to the Human Rights Council, what has been the main problem? The main problem was probably, politically speaking, for a certain number of states that once they had solved their problem with the subcommission, they could start with the other problem they had, namely the information provided to the body by the special procedures. And we see from the very beginning, it is not a majority, obviously, but it is a group of states which is very well organized, and it starts with the code of conduct. And it has to be mentioned here when we discuss about the polarization, the so-called polarization in the Human Rights Council. There is polarization because there are violations. And we, as a civil society organization, obviously, we try to find ways with the body to obtain some decisions in face of these violations. The code of conduct was one. The consultative group was the second initiative to have a better screening for the selection of the mandate holders. And I don't say that it is bad for 100%, but it was also tools to better control the system. And the two initiatives taken last year by the Russian Federation, the first one on developing some working methods for the consultative group, the other one to have a letter addressed to the president of the Human Rights Council on two specific countries, two specific rapporteurs, sorry. The first one on privacy, who, in my view, made mistakes, and the other one on summary execution, who, in my view, made a mandate, no mistake. This goes the same line. It is a pressure by the states. We see also as maybe a detail that even in the UPR interventions of the states, these hardliner states who try to really slow down the development of the process, they are more and more united in their initiatives. Even so, that now they take the floor together and that they make a joint statement with more than 50 countries to say that there is no problem of human rights in Xinjiang in China. So that's really a main problem, and we are facing this problem. Despite this, let me say something about how the NGOs are facing the Human Rights Council. Only some points, because I speak probably now too much. NGOs are interested in the Human Rights Council in the sense that progress has been made in the UN since the creation of the Council in the field of creating accountability mechanisms. The commissions of inquiries, the work on transitional justice, more criminal law. This is something which has been really encouraging. NGOs face, however, a problem with too many gongos, the NGOs created by states to underline the merits of their dictatorships. And NGOs are facing a big problem in the funding capacity they have, because even the traditional Western donors are diminishing their funding capacities. Now, without a strong civil society, I mean a network of 10, 15 organizations in Geneva being at the service of NGOs in the field, without this, the future of the Human Rights Council in dealing with the situations does not exist. You need this feedback, this backup beside the Human Rights Council. Now, reopening the box of Pandora, this will take place soon with the revision of the status of the Council. For me, as an NGO, interested in human rights work and the outcome, the implementation in the field, the problem is not to know whether or not we should start with a good idea. The good idea would be to have a stronger council in the UN system. Now, the problem is to be sure that the outcome of the process will not be worse than the current situation. Because we should not forget that currently the hardliners are dominating.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for this intervention, and actually also the words of caution as to any kind of opening the Pandora's box, but rather also you're pointing to the developments that would be possible. We're running a little bit late, but we still have 15 minutes for the discussion, question and answer. And via the chat, I already noted that Milun Kotari and Christian Strohal asked for the floor. I'll pass the floor to them, please. So even if it's not very necessary for you as you're well known, but introduce yourselves quickly and please rather short intervention and question from your side. And I'll see who else is asking for the floor meanwhile. So Milun Kotari, over to you. Speaker. Milun, you're still muted. Can we unmute Milun? No. Okay, now go.
Okay, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, congratulations, John, on your book. I haven't seen it, but it's wonderful to see you again. I'm Milun Kotari. I'm the president of UPR Info and former special rapporteur on housing at the Human Rights Council. I just wanted to make a sort of conceptual point that when we are trying to address the success or the evolution from the Commission to the Council, it's very important to look at what's happening at the national level. What I see, around the world is actually there's been a tremendous upsurge of activities spurred by the Human Rights Council, whether it's the UPR or the work of the rapporteurs at the national level. And I think that is a success of the system. I mean, when we are sitting here in Geneva, we think of, okay, so there's no civil society participation in the UPR. But the very fact that civil society is involved in the preparation of stakeholder reports and in monitoring what happens with the UPR. So I think our focus has to also be on strengthening national systems, which in a way has been happening largely because of the platform provided by the Council. And I think the second very quick point was a question for John. You mentioned the Vienna World Conference, and there's that tremendous breakthrough on the language on indivisibility of human rights. But one of the real failures I see of the system is that there continues to be a dominance of civil and political rights. And I actually wanted to ask you why this is. Even in the UPR, most of the recommendations are on civil and political rights. And how do we actually get out of that? Because the vast majority of violations around the world are on economic, social, and cultural rights. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Milun, and over to Ambassador Strohal, please.
Well, thank you, and thank you for this great debate and this fantastic panel. And it's of course a pleasure to see John in particular, who has been so instrumental for so many of us in choosing human rights as a life course, together with Bertie Ramcharan. And I'm certainly looking forward to reading the book. I have questions which follow exactly what we have just been hearing from Milun, which is what we are essentially talking about is to have a discussion about the implementation of standards, about responding to violations, giving a voice to victims, and closing possible normative gaps. And in all of this, feedback from the ground and feedback back to the ground is certainly crucial in this global mechanism which we have, because it helps to overcome the overall reluctance of governments to be held accountable. And this also means that we are always in unfinished business. And I share Adrien's point that any revision needs to be an improvement. But I would add that if you look back in time, at any given moment, we had successes beyond what could have been expected realistically at that moment. So I remain an optimist that success is possible in spite of the dwindling political will, in spite of human rights fatigue, and all the rest of it. So my question would be, John, in this broad and long-term perspective you are giving us and your proposal, do you think that another big conference would be more helpful or more dangerous, or can we simply go on doing by doing in incrementally improving the system further to what is already quite a success? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and very interesting question. Another conference or doing by doing, which is I think also what we learned, and Eric was among our speakers in his book, also how the council has worked quite well in recent years. I have one more question from Julio Vega. I'll call on him. And if somebody else would like to ask a question, please flag your interest now by raising your electronic hand or send something through the chat, because we will not have the time for a second round of questions. So if somebody wants to comment or have a question, please bring it in now. And over to Julio, please.
So thank you very much for the question, Sid. We have a very interesting question involving the efficiency process of the Human Rights Council and the participation of civil society organizations. So in light of the initiatives of the Human Rights Council and its efficiency process, the time management during general debates, panels and UPR sessions, as well as the general rationalization of the council's activities have been at stake. However, at the same time, we still observe civil society organizations having a limited participation in the Human Rights Council, especially considering the current difficulties with the pandemic when it comes to contributing some substance to the resolutions and having their voice heard. So take into consideration John Patch's proposal of the civil society chamber, for example. In your opinion, what would be the most appropriate way to balance these two issues? On the one hand, the efficiency process, and on the other hand, an increasing civil society participation. And in addition, how should these issues be addressed in practical terms in the upcoming review status of the Human Rights Council?
Okay, thank you very much. A long question, but I think, yes, coming again to what was also mentioned before in terms of the input by civil society, then the possibilities. I think it was mentioned by you before when you counted also the number of NGOs trying to speak and the question of their credibility. I see another question coming in from Rosa Friedman. I'm just reading while I talk. It's about the proliferation of mandates and the need for more coherence between them. I take special procedure mandates, and how to do this practically when it's rare and politicized for a mandate to be ended indeed. Yes, so noted that one. And if there is another question, I'll happily take one more before then turning back to our panelists. Quickly look into the chat. Okay, well then I think we'll have a lot actually to speak about when we just take in those questions, but also to allow reactions among each other. And if I may go by reverse order and start with you, Adrien, if you'd like to comment again on what was said on those questions just posed. So over to you, please.
Yeah, short remarks. The first, implementation is key. Well, this is, by the way, one of the main objectives of my organization when we train people. having, it is paragraph 77 of the Vienna Programme of Action and Declaration, that states should develop, should elaborate public policies and possibly have program of actions, plan of actions at sectorial level, and or developing also some national mechanisms, and that the civil society locally, nationally should be involved. Now, clearly, what happens currently with the world of the NGOs is that I personally would have absolutely no time to lose to be in a forum of all the NGOs with the Chinese, pro-Chinese Congos. And that the problem is the definition of what would be the civil society. We had not such a problem in '93. Now this problem is really very existential, because almost 40% of all the NGOs are pro-governmental NGOs.
Thank you very much. Let's come to Eric Tistenet, please.
Well, thank you. I will be quite telegraphic. I mean, one issue which I would like to address is civil society, because I think it's important from where I sit. I think there is a contradiction there. I mean, civil society must be given a much bigger role. John is absolutely right in this. And Adrien Claude is also very right, but he's also right in saying that we have seen increasingly a large number of groups, I call them groups, getting into the council. And what you may not even realize when you listen to them, some of them are anti-human rights council and anti-human rights. They are getting into the council to actually go backwards regarding a large number of societal rights, economic, social, cultural, civil and political, and they are speaking day after day. They undermine the weight of serious NGOs. I have no solution, but this is actually undermining the weight of civil society and the way they really have a say at the council level. Because when you are sitting at the podium and when you're listening to the bunch of NGOs, and when out of 200 of them, only 40 or 30% are actually making sense, I'm sorry to say so, then it undermines the whole civil society. And something must be done at the level of New York. That's very clear, but also at one stage one has to be thinking about it innovatively regarding what the council may or may not be doing. Regarding the question of Rosa about the special rapporteur, if I had a magical wand, I would immediately reply to you. I could say that I don't have enough time to respond to your question, which would be a bit too easy. But what I would say is that in the past 2 years, in the context of the efficiency, when there were the two former presidents working on this in terms of the biannualization or triennialization of resolutions, what was supposed to be impossible actually proved to be possible in certain limited instances. So I think that it may be possible to explore this option of getting really talking individual to every single sponsors and try to see whether we can reduce this number. It will be very hard. I'm not, very optimistic about it, but I think a pragmatic approach may possibly be working, provided this is being done systematically and across the board. And it could be done if this were to touch on all major civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights issues. If it is only one or the other, it won't fly. But that could be a possibility. But it would take a long time to dwell on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Ambassador Stevens, please.
She's my.
Could you unmute her, please?
Yeah, I think what is coming out of our discussions here is basically that for us, the ultimate objective is to improve the effectiveness and impact of the human rights mechanisms. And whether or not just changing its status would do that by itself without looking at some of these issues which have been brought up in these discussions is something that we need to look at. Because already with the present system, there's so much that could be done to improve the effectiveness and impact. We have heard about the special procedures, we've heard about the civil society, how can we improve it? And I think focus should go into that to see how much we can achieve with what we have, because changing the status which involves, again, looking at changing the contents of the UN Charter is something which we cannot hope to achieve. And to be realistic, it's something which is not going to be easy and something which is going to be difficult to achieve. So we should concentrate on how we can get this council to have a greater impact. And on that, I would end on the note that greater focus on prevention would be the key, one of the keys in which the council could improve its impact. And the link also with the Security Council is extremely important. And these are the areas where we need to work with, and we have to push this forward to make sure that the impact is enhanced. Thank you. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And over to you, Ambassador Kieselberger, please.
Well, thank you very much. And I have already spoken for a very long time, and I could probably go on, but let me just say this. Some of the panelists mentioned quite rightly that we have to make sure that the review, if it happens, doesn't make things worse than what they are at the moment. And I think here we are at the crucial stage, because this pandemic, which has caused a major crisis in terms of health, in terms of the economy, but also in terms of human rights, is a real risk that some people who don't like the Human Rights Council anyway will spread even more their narrative that human rights are a kind of luxury, something secondary we can think about once all the other problems have gone away. So this is a real danger in political terms, and we have to make sure that we use all the instruments we have to prevent this. The other thing is that we're not very good at explaining what the council does. I bet there are not many people, even in Geneva, who could give a reasonable explanation what we are doing. And this is a danger in itself, in a way. But what we have seen in the last weeks is actually quite interesting. Not that the council managed to improve the situation in Myanmar, let's say. But there was a UPR of Myanmar a few days before the putsch. You can say this was a coincidence that they waited. It could also not be a coincidence. We have seen that before the day of the special session on Myanmar, they released 20,000 detainees. A few days after, they made new detainees, but somehow it seems that even countries where you think they couldn't care less about the Human Rights Council do look at what we are doing. We are seeing from a particular country, which is on the agenda for next week's votes, that they are flooding us with their information in order to contradict what NGOs and others are saying, what is happening about them. So the council clearly has a nuisance value to a lot of governments whom we would like to nudge to do things differently. But the real problem is that the wider audience doesn't see that. And I would have liked to work on the better public diplomacy of the council last year, and it wasn't possible because of the pandemic and everything. But I keep thinking that this really is a deficit, and I hope one day we'll be able to embark on it. Thank you all very much. It was a very interesting discussion.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And to all of you, please do bear with us for some more minutes, even though we'll run a little bit late, because now, of course, John, we'd like to hear your reactions also to those questions just posed now and to the input of the other panelists, the reactions to your book. So the floor is yours, John.
Thank you so much, Felix. So many good friends, so many new friends. I'm moved by the names I see, and I know where they are and where they stand on human rights. I will just go over the points that I have recorded in order to mark where we go from here. The point on the agenda, which was made by Ambassador Kieselberger, was the very important one. If you look at the annotations of the current session and you look at the actual agenda, the wealth in the annotations is nowhere near what the agenda says. All I ask you is to look at those two documents and see for yourselves. If you look at the program of work, all you see is the agenda item. But in reality, each agenda item contains a huge amount of very important issues. It is in fact a shame that the council decided on the standardized agenda, but at that time it was apparently a politically convenient compromise. Remember that in the mid-70s, the Commission had worked itself into a standstill. It was postponing most of the items on its agenda. There was one year when they only took up 2 items on this 22-item agenda. And it was in 1978, in fact, when the Commission decided to become serious about the organization of its work and started a calendar and a system of addressing issues, which continued until the late 1990s. So I think that is important. Another one is Milun's remark and Ambassador Spitzelberger's remark on human rights and business. The book has a number of areas which focuses on what it calls the great divorce regarding the separation between economic, social, and cultural rights and civil and political rights. And that is a divorce that is still as present as it was back in 1952. There's no two ways about it. We have called it different things. We've done a lot of cosmetic attempts, but that separation is still there. And until that separation is addressed, we will never have a meaningful realization of human rights. It also has, the infection has continued to spread. And here I come to Ambassador Spitzelberger's remark about human rights and business, because the current situation with regard to the domination of multinational corporations and business in general over the intergovernmental process, to the extent that at least one intergovernmental body had to rely on private contributions in order for it to subsist, signals a very, very serious evolution. So you're right, and that's why there is in the book a chapter dedicated to what is known as the incubation of economic and social rights, and how multinationals became business. 1999 came the Global Compact with the self-regulating so-called mechanism, which, as you know, does not work. You will see in Australia and so many countries in the United States where business takes over. Not business, but profit-making, unfettered profit-making to the detriment of the enjoyment of economic, social, cultural rights, and therefore civil and political rights. So that one needs, up to today, the Economic and Social Council has not taken the request made 5 or 6 years ago by the Assembly to ask the states parties to the Economic, Social, Cultural Covenant to be responsible for the election of the members of the committee, as distinct from the Economic and Social Cultural Rights Committee. So you have a big problem, but there is hope. I will not go further, but there is a lot to be said on that. Then there is the question of the Congo. The intention of the Chamber on Civil Society is precisely to try to create a mechanism whereby the civil society can purify itself to some extent. That is taken from the experiences made in Bangkok in 1993, and to some extent in the other preparatory meetings of the World Conference. There should be perhaps in the plenary of the Council, like there is a high-level segment, maybe a low-level, civil society segment, where you can let loose all the NGOs you want, and they can show up for themselves what they really are. But within the civil society community, at the regional level, and then at the international level, it is very important to get civil society to regulate itself to the extent that is. All this is all contingent on good faith. And that is where the problem, of course, lies in regard across the board. At the moment, we are still like this fear of amending the Charter. The Charter has been amended several times. Why is it such a problem to amend it again? Why do we have to persist with a system which is totally untenable of having a kind of beauty pageant of states so that somebody can decide who deserves to be on the 47 or who does not? This is a distraction. It creates bad blood. It preconditions participants. unnecessarily. That 4 to 7 limitation is not sustainable. It is counterproductive, and whether it needs a charter amendment or not, it has to go. Like the filtering of the NGO participation. Julio, your question on the efficiency. Well, I do believe that the proliferation of mandates is clear. I had the mixed fortune of being in charge of civil special procedures in the first 10 years of their existence, when they were ad hoc procedures. By the time they were turned into a system, in fact, they are not a system. They are a set of ad hoc procedures because they are limited by their mandates. But as a result, we are in a situation where there are 3 or 4 mandates supposedly protecting the human rights of women. There can never be enough. But what matters is the content and the efficiency, not the proliferation. It's the same argument that underlies the flooding of the NGO market, if you like, in the council context. So I do think that mandates have to be seriously vetted for efficiency. There's no question about it. It has become too much, as it was always to some extent, a matter of convenience. But nevertheless, if we really want this system, as we call it now, to continue, we need A, to distill it, and B, to have a more intelligent kind of flow between the jurisprudence of the treaty bodies, the lessons learned of the special procedures, and of course the work of the council. There is lots that we can develop, and I don't have the time here, but I'm very happy to take up with you at any time the various ideas that flow very much from putting together this work. I'm not trying to sell the book, because I know that we all bought it already anyway, but you can buy a second copy if you wish. Seriously speaking, I do think that there's a lot that we can do with what comes out of this compendium, if you like. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. And there is, with the announcement of the event, there's also a discount flyer to buy the book, just to complement that part. Also to say that actually, as you all relate to special procedures, the mandates, their efficiency, maybe to say that we're also at the Academy in a process with a lot of mandate holders actually to look into how to measure effectiveness of special procedures. So that could also be of interest to you. So thank you all for participating. Thank you very much to John, to all the panelists for taking your time, for intervening, to all of you for participating and listening, and to coming in from also far away into that meeting. So for hours that are less convenient to you than they are for us. Stay tuned. Maybe subscribe to the new newsletter of the Geneva Human Rights Platform, so you'll see that what the next human rights conversations are coming up that we'll be organizing. Again, thank you all very much, and I'm looking forward to staying in touch with all of you for those discussions around the functioning of the Geneva-based UN human rights mechanisms, in particular the Human Rights Council here. Thank you, and goodbye. Have a good day, evening, morning, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.